Chapter 2. Tomorrow, of course, meant only time and not daylight. They rose to the same darkness that had always blanketed the sunless half of Venus, with the same eternal sunset green on the horizon at the barrier. But Pat was in better humor and went eagerly about the preparations for their first venture into the open. She brought out the parkas of inch-thick wool sheathed in rubber, and Ham, in his capacity as engineer, carefully inspected the hoods, each with its crown of powerful lamps. These were primarily for vision, of course, but they had another purpose. It was known that the incredibly fierce trioptes could not face light, and thus, by using all four beams in the helmet, one could move, surrounded by a protective aura. But that did not prevent both of them from including in their equipment 2 blunt blue automatics and a pair of terrifically destructive flame pistols. And Pat carried a bag at her belt, into which she proposed to drop specimens of any dark side flora she encountered, and fauna too, if it proved small and harmless enough. They grinned at each other through their masks. "Makes you look fat," observed Ham maliciously, and enjoyed her sniff of annoyance. She turned, threw open the door, and stamped into the open. It was different from looking out through a port. Then the scene had some of the unreality and all of the immobility and silence of a picture, but now it was actually around them, and the cold breath and mournful voice of the underwind proved definitely enough that the world was real. For a moment they stood in the circlet of light from the rocket ports, staring awestruck at the horizon, where the unbelievable peaks of the greater eternities towered black against the false sunset. Nearer, for as far as vision reached through that sunless, moonless, starless region, was a desolate, tumbled plain, where peaks, minarets, spires, and ridges of ice and stone rose in indescribable and fantastic shapes, carved by the wild artistry of the underwind. Ham slipped a padded arm around Pat, and was surprised to feel her shiver. "Cold?" he asked, glancing at the dial thermometer on his wrist. "It's only 36 below." "I'm not cold," replied Pat. "It's the scenery, that's all." She moved away. "I wonder what keeps the place as warm as it is. Without sunlight, you'd think—" "Then you'd be wrong," cut in Ham. "Any engineer knows that gases diffuse. The upper winds are going by just 5 or 6 miles over our heads, and they naturally carry a lot of heat from the desert beyond the twilight. There's some diffusion of the warm air into the cold, and then, besides, as the warm winds cool, they tend to sink. And what's more, the contour of the country has a lot to do with it." He paused. "Say," he went on reflectively, "I shouldn't be surprised if we found sections near the eternities where there was a downdraft, where the upper winds slid right along the slope and gave certain places a fairly bearable climate." He followed Pat as she poked around the boulders near the edge of the circle of light from the rocket. "Ha!" she exclaimed. "There it is, Ham. There's our specimen of dark-side plant life." She bent over a gray bulbous mass. "Lichenous or fungoid," she continued. "No leaves, of course. Leaves are only useful in sunlight. No chlorophyll for the same reason. A very primitive, very simple plant, and yet in some ways not simple at all. Look, Ham, a highly developed circulatory system." He leaned closer, and in the dim yellow light from the ports, he saw the fine tracery of veins she indicated. "That," she proceeded, "would indicate a sort of heart, and I wonder—" Abruptly she thrust her dial thermometer against the fleshy mass, held it there a moment, and then peered at it. "Yes, look how the needles moved, Ham. It's warm, a warm-blooded plant. And when you think of it, it's only natural, because that's the one sort of plant that could live in a region forever below freezing. Life must be lived in liquid water." She tugged at the thing, and with a sullen plump it came free, and dark driblets of liquid welled out of the torn root. "Ugh!" exclaimed Ham. "What a disgusting thing! And tore the bleeding mandragore, hey? Only they were supposed to scream when you uprooted them." He paused. A low, pulsing, welling whimper came out of the quivering mass of pulp, and he turned a startled gaze on Pat. "Ugh!" he grunted again. "Disgusting!" "Disgusting? Why, it's a beautiful organism. It's adapted perfectly to its environment." "Well, I'm glad I'm an engineer," he growled, watching Pat as she opened the rocket's door and laid the thing on a square of rubber within. "Come on, let's look around." Pat closed the door and followed him away from the rocket. Instantly the night folded in around them like a black mist, and it was only by glancing back at the lighted ports that Pat could convince herself that they stood in a real world. "Should we light our helmet lamps?" asked Ham. "We'd better, I suppose, or risk a fall." Before either could move further, a sound struck through the moaning of the underwind, a wild, fierce, unearthly shrieking like laughter in hell, hoots and howls, and mirthless chuckling noises. "It's Triops!" gasped Pat, forgetting plurals and grammar alike. She was frightened. Ordinarily she was as courageous as Ham, and rather more reckless and daring, but those uncanny shrieks brought back the moments of torment when they had been trapped in the canyon in the mountains of eternity. She was badly frightened, and fumbled frantically and ineffectually at light switch and revolver. Just as a half-dozen stones hummed fast as bullets around them, and one crashed painfully on Ham's arm, he flicked on his lights. 4 beams shot in a long cross on the glittering peaks, and the wild laughter rose in a crescendo of pain. He had a momentary glimpse of shadowy figures flinging themselves from pinnacle and ridge, flitting spectre-like into the darkness, and then silence. "Oh," murmured Pat, "I was scared, Ham." She huddled against him, then continued more strongly, "But there's proof. Triops noctivivens actually is a night-side creature, and those in the mountains are outposts or fragments that have wandered into the sunless chasms." Far off sounded the hooting laughter. "I wonder," mused Ham, "if that noise of theirs is in the nature of a language." "Very probably. After all, the Hotland natives are intelligent, and these creatures are a related species. Besides, they throw stones, and they know the use of those smothering pods they showered on us in the canyon, which, by the way, must be the fruit of some night-side plant. The Trioptes are doubtless intelligent in a fierce, bloodthirsty, barbaric fashion, but the beasts are so unapproachable that I doubt if human beings ever learn much of their minds or language." Ham agreed emphatically, the more so as a viciously cast rock suddenly chipped glittering particles from an icy spire a dozen paces away. He twisted his head, sending the beams of his helmet lamps angling over the plain, and a single shrill cachinnation drifted out of the dark. "Thank heaven the lights keep 'em fairly out of range," he muttered. "These are pleasant little subjects of His Majesty, aren't they? God save the king, if he had many more like 'em." But Pat was again engaged in her search for specimens. She had switched on her lamps now, and scrambled agilely in and out among the fantastic monuments of that bizarre plain. Ham followed her, watching as she wrenched up bleeding and whimpering vegetation. She found a dozen varieties, and one little wriggling, cigar-shaped creature that she gazed at in perplexity, quite unable to determine whether it was plant, animal, or neither. And at last her specimen bag was completely filled, and they turned back over the plain toward the rocket, whose ports gleamed afar like a row of staring eyes. But a shock awaited them as they opened the door to enter. Both of them started back at the gust of warm, stuffy, putrid, and unbreathable air that gushed into their faces with an odor of carrion. "What?" gasped Ham, and then laughed. "Your mandragore," he chuckled. "Look at it." The plant she had placed within was a mass of decayed corruption. In the warmth of the interior it had decomposed rapidly and completely, and was now but a semi-liquid heap on the rubber mat. She pulled it through the entrance and flung mat and all away. They clambered into an interior still reeking, and Ham set a ventilator spinning. The air that came in was cold, of course, but pure with the breath of the underwind, sterile and dustless from its sweep across 5,000 miles of frozen oceans. They were on British territory, being in the latitude of Venoble. The International Congress at Lisle had, in 2020, apportioned the dark side rights by giving to each nation owning Venusian possessions a wedge extending from the twilight zone to a point on the planet directly opposite the sun in mid-autumn and mountains. He swung the door closed, set a heater going, and dropped his visor to grin at Pat. "So that's your beautiful organism," he chuckled. It was a beautiful organism, Ham. You can't blame it because we exposed it to temperatures it was never supposed to encounter." She sighed and slung her specimen pouch to the table. "I'll have to prepare these at once, I suppose, since they don't keep." Ham grunted and set about the preparation of a meal, working with the expert touch of a true Hotlander. He glanced at Pat as she bent over her specimens, injecting the bichloride solution. "Do you suppose," he asked, "that the triops is the highest form of life on the dark side?" "Beyond doubt," replied Pat. "If any higher form existed, it would long ago have exterminated those fierce devils." But she was utterly wrong.